Hey, everybody. So, today I want to discuss a topic that I've been thinking about for years and I've discussed off and on with people for years, and that's why isn't boxing as popular as it used to be? Back when I was growing up, I remember watching a lot of boxing fairly regularly. Boxing news seemed to be covered a lot, and boxing was just seemed to be everywhere in general, and there was a lot of advertisements on everything for all the big fights. Of my grandpa and I watching a lot of boxing matches together, and we would discuss all the important fighters and the notable boxers from the old days or in the past, and even the current ones that were popular. And when I say current, I mean, in the 80s and 90s, back when there was a lot of famous and popular boxers and boxing matches on. This may seem a little bit funny, but one of the things that sticks in my mind when I was growing up was the Sugar Ray Robinson versus Tommy Hearns. It was their second fight in 1989. And I just remember the cups that you would get from McDonald's or the convenience store. They'd advertise these fights. And I remember seeing, Sugar Ray Robinson Hearns 2 being on the side of these cups, and it would have the boxers on there. And I just, I can't imagine seeing a boxing ad for a big fight on a McDonald's soft drink cup nowadays. Go ahead and put in the comments if I'm wrong on that, but that's something I remember. It was a big deal. Like I said, boxing just seemed to be everywhere. So what are people saying is the reason for the decline in boxing? Now, I started researching it recently myself, and I've, obviously had conversations through the years about it, like I mentioned before. And the number one thing that comes up, and the reason that I personally have always believed that boxing has lost some popularity, is because of the crazy exponential growth of the mixed martial arts scene, and specifically the UFC. And I know that myself personally, I started to switch over from watching boxing to UFC probably at least 15 years ago. So I've spoken in another video about how big of a Chuck Liddell fan I am. And, I even remember watching some of the UFC matches back in the 90s. And that was back when they didn't have a lot of rules, and a lot of the states still had mixed martial arts fighting outlawed. And so I think even back then, maybe it started to get popular, but it wasn't until the early 2000s when Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, and a lot of these other UFC fighters really became, famous or more popular, and they started to appear on television. I think that's really when the mixed martial arts and UFC scene would have started to really take away from boxing. But back in the 90s, boxing was still definitely the king as far as combat sports goes, and especially on television, or as far as the mainstream goes, and like I mentioned before with advertisements and everything else. But anyway, there were still a lot of very popular and famous boxers back in the 90s, and we'll go ahead and discuss some of those boxers and talk about some of those famous 80s and 90s boxers in a little bit. But first, let's go ahead and get to a list of 5 reasons why I think boxing has waned in popularity, or has not become, it's become not as popular as it used to be. Number 1, the UFC and MMA's emergence on the scene the last 10 or 15 years. We just touched on it, and I mean, there's just no way to deny that has to be one of the reasons. And I'm not going to get into all the reasons right now, but definitely that's got to be a factor whenever I talk to people. And, like I said, me personally, that's what I would have said before doing any research of why boxing isn't as popular anymore. It's just because, hey, mixed martial arts, UFC, it's on TV, it's everywhere, it's in everybody's mind, it's more popular, and some would argue it's a lot more exciting, and that would have probably been the reason I would have said. Number 2, the judging seems like it's been off for boxing for a long time. The judges and the overall sport seems corrupt in nature to a lot of people. And even though I don't think it's the central reason that boxing has lost some popularity, I feel it's definitely a factor. And I can just say in a lot of the boxing matches that I've watched specifically, and even the UFC too, to some extent, there are terrible decisions. Sometimes I just want to ask the judges, what in tarnation are you thinking, judge? The other guy won the fight. It's obvious. Are you blind? But I just say that there's that old saying, too, that still rings true, and I'm sure we've all heard it a million times. Don't leave the decision in the judge's hands. Go ahead and finish that guy if you want to win. And While that's true to some extent, that being said, judging should still be fair. But, of course, judging is subjective. And like a lot of things that are subjective, it's sometimes not going to be a perfect science. And, for instance, one of the biggest examples of this is, if you want to beat a champion in boxing especially, you have to beat them decisively. If you don't knock him out or knock him down several times, you better have won most of those rounds, pretty decisively, or you're probably not going to win that fight. And I think that could even go into a lot of other combat sports as well, but specifically in boxing, I feel like. Number 3, there aren't a lot of popular fighters in boxing anymore, or not as many as there were in the past. For instance, the last 30 to 40 years. And we'll be getting back to that also at the end of the video, because I think that ties into another point, and it goes a lot deeper. But we'll touch on that in a minute. So the other 2 reasons are, number 4, and I feel like these last 2 are pretty much just side notes to all this, but there isn't as much major network coverage, or very little major network coverage for boxing anymore. And last but not least, number 5, and this feeds right into the last one, most of the boxing that used to be on TV for free, and now most of the important fights, they're always on pay-per-view. And I know some people would argue, and even I would, that that's not really that valid of a point, though, because the UFC still sells a ton of pay-per-view, and most of those important fights are on pay-per-view now in mixed martial arts, as far as the UFC goes anyway. And it really hasn't hurt the UFC much, or the mixed martial arts much. But now, will a lot of the important fights and big matches that are all on pay-per-view now, will it hurt the UFC in the future? I think it's too early to be said. I know that I don't buy as many as I used to buy anymore, and there are some other productions like Bellator and some others that are starting to come up and maybe starting to steal some attention from the UFC, but maybe the UFC will just buy them out, and that's something that they seem to do. But anyway, enough about that. So because I do believe a big part of this video in why boxing has lost some popularity is because there's not as many popular boxers like there was back in the 80s and 90s. I thought I would cover some of the most famous and popular boxers from the past. In the 1980s, we can talk about guys like Marvelous Marvin Hagler. I mean, come on, he was huge back in the 80s. Also, Roberto Hands of Stone Duran, who is one of my favorite fighters to watch. And his resurgence in the 90s, he was older then, but I still loved watching him. Mike Tyson. How can we leave out Iron Mike Tyson? Thomas Hearns, Sugar Ray Leonard, Julio Cesar Chavez, always coming out with his bandana looking really tough, and he was a very exciting fighter. Evander Holyfield in the 80s, and Larry Holmes was obviously still fighting in the 80s and even into the 90s. He is another one of those fighters, much like George Foreman, that his career spanned 30 years. And there's so many more I could go over, but that's all the 80s ones I wanted to mention for now. And I think the bigger point here is that sports is carried by its stars, and especially in America. And I'm sure it's that way all over the world, but here, since I live in America, I would say that there's just not as many stars in boxing as there used to be. Some of the big stars in the 90s as far as boxing goes, you have guys like James Toney, Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, and again, a lot of these flowed over from the 80s. Roy Jones Jr., who was one of my favorite fighters. Evander Holyfield was also one of my favorites. Lennox Lewis from the UK. Oscar De La Hoya. I remember in his 20s, he used to knock a lot of people out, and then towards the latter part of his career, he sort of seemed like he forgot how to do that, and he's been in the news again recently as far as mixed martial arts goes, but I did cover some of that in another video. Pernell Whitaker. Then you have Bernard Hopkins. George Foreman and his comeback in the 90s, and like I mentioned before, him and Larry Holmes fought for like 30 years. Riddick Bowe, Felix Trinidad, and then you have Manny Pacquiao, who is still famous today. and who is also a politician in his home country. He's, still one of the most popular boxers today, even though he was fighting back in the 90s. And then last but not least, Floyd Mayweather Jr., who obviously is still about the most famous boxer out there, even though he's semi-retired. He had the boxing match not long ago with Conor McGregor. And then you had some others I'll name: Sugar Shane Mosley, Marco Antonio Barrera, Vitaly Klitschko. He's still famous in the boxing world today. Prince Nassim Hamed, who was very exciting. He was a little bit cocky in the ring, but he was really fun to watch when he had his winning streak. There's also Hector Macho Camacho, and then you have Tommy Morrison, rest in peace, and David Tua. Now, I could talk about the 1990s boxing stars all day. I could make an entire video series on those guys, and I did want to also mention some of my favorite boxers that may have not been the most famous or even, the number one boxers out there, but I always liked Diego Corrales, who is also a really good one, and Arturo Gatti. A lot of these guys were just really fun to watch. Anyway, there's just, like I said, there's too many to list, and maybe it's also because I was a huge boxing fan in the 80s and 90s growing up, and maybe not as much today, but as a teen in the 90s, I really watched a lot because my grandparents, when we could afford it, we had Showtime and HBO, and a lot of the boxing matches and the big, boxing matches and the popular fighters and the championships, they were available to me at that time, and they were on network television or on one of those premium channels. And, of course, like I mentioned before, most of those are on pay-per-view today. So we talked a little bit earlier about how there's not as many popular and famous boxers today that there was in the 80s and 90s. And I think it's important to delve a lot deeper into this because I really think it's the number one central issue, even though there are a multitude of reasons that we discussed. And there's an article here I was reading, Boxing Popularity Decline in the U.S., The Real Reason Why, FightSaga.com. And in 2015, boxing legend Mike Tyson appeared on Comedy Central's The Nightly Show with Larry Wilmore. And when asked what advice he'd give to an aspiring young boxer, Tyson replied, "Go to the MMA." And I know I kind of joked about that earlier. And, when someone as popular as Tyson disses a sport that made him a star, you've got to ask why. And in this article, it kind of goes into why that boxing is in such terrible shape in America, that someone who has grown to become a face for the sport would advise, youngsters to jump ship and go into MMA. Of course, he says no. So MMA hasn't really taken the focus off boxing and reduced its popularity worldwide. It's really just in America. So when you start really looking into this, how the landscape has changed in boxing in the U.S. since the 90s, he discussed with Tyson that a lot of it has to do with how the sport is enjoying a renaissance of sorts in the Europe areas, Germany, Poland, Russia, and the UK. So how and why? Well, the USSR and the communist bloc have something to do with it. When the Berlin Wall came crashing down in 1989 and the USSR collapsed soon after, few understood the profound impact those historic events would have on professional boxing. Prior to the 1990s, athletes in some parts of the world, like Russia, couldn't even turn pro due to their socialistic economic systems. Hence, fellows like Sergei Kovalev and Gennady Golovkin, Triple G, one of my favorite fighters nowadays, wouldn't have been able to compete in the pros back in the 90s because of their economic system. So, perhaps they would have burst onto the scene in the late 90s like Andrew Galata, but would have had years of catching up to do, as many former Eastern Bloc nations were still too new to be competitive in professional sports in the mid and late 90s. Simply put, the fall of the USSR and spread of capitalism to other parts of the world have produced countries that are embracing boxing and cultivating professions because fighters can now keep the money they earn. Prior to the 1990s, any earned income boxing would have been seized by their government. So I think that's important to talk about. Also looking at an article here on Forbes.com, and it said, "Don't believe the hype, professional boxing is thriving worldwide." If you want to find this article, I'm not going to try to read as much of this article as I did the last one, but it pretty much just talks about how the increase in international boxing promotions and champions have been responsible for boxing's growth around the world, not so much in America. It says not only is boxing dead, it has made a resurgence and recaptured a piece of the worldwide market share it lost to mixed martial arts over the past 12 years when the UFC launched its first season of The Ultimate Fighter in 2005. So, it's just internationally gotten a lot bigger. And it also goes on to discuss how it wasn't long ago observers were buying into the rhetoric that boxing was dead, while many were quick to write boxing's obituary altogether. And in the spirit of Mark Twain, rumors of boxing's death have been greatly exaggerated. After doing some of this research, I have come to the conclusion that, yes, there's a multitude of reasons that boxing has lost popularity. And, if you have any other reasons that you've come up with, if there's anything I've left out, please put it down in the comments. In fact, if there are any 80s or 90s boxers that I've left out, because I know I've left a lot of them out, if you want to put some in the comments that maybe I didn't mention, I would enjoy that. But pretty much talent-wise, and in America specifically, North America, Puerto Rico, and the UK, we no longer have a monopoly on professional boxing. A lot of the talented boxers around the world they're in areas that are just not as familiar in the United States, or marketing-wise, they're just not as well known. And so they're from across the pond. They're from countries we're not paying attention to as much. They're not getting as much network coverage, commercials. They're not on the Wheaties box, in other words. So this international competition in boxing has really created a lot of champions that are not American. And if you go to Wikipedia, you can see that a really good portion of the boxing champions are from a lot of these countries like Ukraine that nobody's really paying as much attention to. And I guess if you're a hardcore boxing fan, you have paid attention to them. But me just being a very casual fan nowadays, I haven't taken notice as well. So I'd in fact argue that, after doing this research that on boxers and some of the champions online, that the pool of talent in boxing is greater than it ever was. It's just more spread out, and we don't have as many U.S. champions as we did in the 80s and 90s, and as many famous and popular boxers like we did in the 80s and 90s. Anyway, so, yep, the USSR, the Berlin Wall, and all those kinds of things, capitalism spreading to some of those areas have really impacted it. And what can you really say about that? Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, please go ahead and like and subscribe. And like I said before, if there's anything that you think I left out as far as reasons why boxing has declined in popularity over here, or if I've left out some of your favorite boxers from the 80s and 90s, or even some ones today that you wanted to mention, go ahead and put that down in the comments. Thanks, and have a great day.